I'm Ryan Wayne, Executive Director of Politics at the Tony Blair Institute, and I run the Future of Britain programme. It's a really important piece of work for us because what we're trying to do is create a space, a political space, but not belonging to any particular political party, that looks at the big systemic challenges facing our country, the long-term issues that lie ahead, tech transformation, climate change, a change in geopolitical climate as well, and trying to understand that in order then to introduce a suite of policies, a set of ideas that can move Britain from this collective sense of decline and pessimism into a country that's ready to fight and face the future and seize its opportunities as well as confront its challenges, which is why it's really important we talk about the economy. So joined today by Paul Johnson. Paul has written an excellent book, and I'm not just saying this, I've genuinely read it from page to page, front to back. It's excellent. And the reason why it's so good is that I approach policy and politics from the political perspective. I get excited about big, whizzy ideas. I get excited about the day-to-day of politics. I've felt a little bit intimidated, if you like, by what happens over at number 11. But I think what you've done in this book, Paul, is achieved the impossible of making the economy accessible and understandable. And anyone who wants to interact with politics, anyone who wants to go into politics, you really do have to read this. So we'll make sure that it's an opportunity to purchase it after the event. So who is Paul Johnson, other than the author of this phenomenal book? Paul is a director of Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. The IFS has been there for some time. They are the leading voice on anything regarding the economy. But Paul also sits on the Committee for Climate Change, which is a non-partisan body that's looking at the impact of climate change and how we mitigate it in the UK. But prior to that, you served your time in the civil service, at the DfE and also at the Treasury. So you've got an understanding from inside government as well as from the outside. And you're also one of the rarest of species, someone who graduated from PPE in Oxbridge and actually understands how the economy runs. So your book, Follow the Money. Let's start off, Paul, just by asking why you wrote this book and what you wanted to achieve.
That's a very good question. I asked myself that many times whilst I was doing it. I bought it so everyone could buy it. I wrote it so everyone could buy it, obviously. So please do.
You're a bit for the economy.
Absolutely. Look, I've been. So I didn't come into this book with any big idea. I mean, you won't find through this, the answer is tax the rich or reduce the size of the state or a universal basic income or you do everything in one way or another. I came to this because I'd been working in this for these sorts of issues for a very long time. Thought I had something to say, which I could say in a way that people would understand, and really from a huge frustration at the quality of policy making, at the stupidity, budget after budget after budget after budget of what we see in tax policy, of the failure to get education policy on a sensible track. And because I just wanted to set out part of the reason for that is I also wanted to just set out this is hard, it's difficult. And again, you get lots of commentators and very often politicians, because that's the easy message, saying, there is an obvious answer to this or that. Well, one of the things you'll see on virtually every page here is that there are trade-offs, that we make decisions for a reason. There are very, very few things that you can do that will make everybody better off and nobody worse off by doing them. You make any change to the tax system, that's obviously true. You increase spending, well, you're making someone worse off because you're going to, in the end, having to increase tax to do it. You can obviously do things which are good for the economy in the long run, but you think of many of the policies that we need for growth, and we might come on to this in a minute, but my view is that we've neglected policies that would be good for growth because we've given too much weight to people immediately affected, whether that's people who would have new houses built near them or new airports built near them, or because we're too scared of changing the tax system because we want to take back control in the context of Brexit or whatever you might think the benefits of that would be. We've followed policy after policy after policy where, yes, it is true that other policies would have been bad for some people, but the cumulative effect of what we've done, I think, has been very bad for the UK as a whole.
Absolutely. So I'd love to explore some of those trade-offs shortly, but maybe we could follow the structure of the book actually. So let's start off by talking about tax. And one of the great things about reading this is it arms you with anecdote for dinner party conversation. I tested this out with my wife. She was a bit annoyed towards the end, but effectively given. So let's talk about, I'd love your views on what a principled, coherent tax system should look like in the UK, but just to illustrate why it's not that. 3 anecdotes from your book. So first of all, a Jaffa cake is a chocolate-covered cake, not a chocolate-covered biscuit. McVitie's went to court on this to fight for its right to be recognised as a chocolate-covered biscuit.
No, other way around, cake.
As a chocolate-covered cake, because that didn't attract tax, but a chocolate-covered biscuit did. Subway can't class its bread as bread for tax purposes. It's got too much sugar in. Is that right? And then choosing a pet, this is life advice. When you're choosing a pet, go for a rabbit, because rabbits are considered edible and therefore don't attract VAT. What does a coherent principled tax system look like, and how do we get there?
And that's not the reason why there's a rabbit on the front page. That's a very big question. But you sort of those anecdotes about VAT kind of give you part of the answer, and part of the answer is that a coherent tax system needs to tax similar things similarly. And if you don't tax similar things similarly, then you get into all sorts of complexities, and you can have lots of fun, honestly, with the VAT system because of the sorts of absurdities that you've just described. But you get similar issues with income that is paid to people for the work that they do. You'll all have seen the recent coverage of the Gary Lineker case, which I also mention in the book, where he's paid, I think this is mostly because the BBC insisted on it rather than it him being his fault, but he's paid huge amounts less tax than he would have done had he been employed by the BBC. So he's done two things, could have done two things, which are essentially exactly the same thing. One, present Match of the Day as a BBC employee, and two, present Match of the Day and paid for via his his limited partnership that he set up with his ex-wife. And under one system, you pay, I can't remember the numbers, but millions of pounds less in tax than under the other system. Now, that is not a coherent tax system. It creates the kind of legal issues that we've had. So tax similar things similarly, unless there's a very, very, very good reason not to do so, would certainly be the start of it. And the second part of it is, you talked about the tax system. Treat the tax system as a system. And we quite often just think about one tax in isolation from another. Let's make a change to corporation tax, for example. Well, corporation tax, the structure and the rate makes a big difference to these incentives as to whether you incorporate or whether you're self-employed. And it also affects the taxation of savings. All of these things are linked in really quite complicated ways. And yet, budget by budget, we have changes to individual taxes with no strategy. And I think tax is the only bit of government policy where there has never been a published strategy, because the Treasury doesn't behave like that. It doesn't publish tax strategies, because this is something for the budget, something for the Chancellor at the budget.
Can I just ask about that Treasury behaviour? Because I think one of the themes running through this book is that politics and politicians, and that by extension voters, need to take a different approach to this. But why haven't the Treasury ever done a tax strategy? Why are they resistant to this? You've worked in that.
Indeed, and I mean, rather secretly, a tax strategy was written by officials at the Treasury when Gordon Brown was Chancellor, and then it was insisted that every single one of them be destroyed before they ever saw the light of day. I think there are some good reasons in the sense that if you sort of fly kites on tax, then that really can not just move markets, but give people all sorts of incentives to avoid tax and so on if they think a particular change is going to happen. But there are very, very bad reasons for it as well. In particular, Chancellor's just very keen on bouncing up on budget day and rabbits coming out of hats. Hence the cover. And part of the issue here is that because there isn't a strategy, we just have no idea which way policy is going to go. So look at the last budget just a few weeks ago. I won't go into the details, but there was a change to the taxation of pensions, got rid of the lifetime allowance. Well, that's a complete reversal of policy of the last 13 years, during which the lifetime and annual allowances have been cut each year. Look at corporation tax. The announcement to increase it was made 2 years ago, and a couple of weeks before the financial year, a massive increase in corporation tax allowances was announced. Now, if there's one thing that corporates and people saving for their pensions need, it's some kind of certainty over the longish term. And they've had nothing even vaguely approaching that. And the lack of any strategy there, I think, is genuinely costly, not just to individuals, but to the economy.
Absolutely. I was also struck by who we rely on the tax from. So I think in your book, you said we rely on the top 1% of earners for 30% of tax revenues. That's 30%, right?
Yeah, it's 30% of income tax is paid by the top 1%, and something like, I can't remember, 7 or 8% by the top 0.1%. Now, this partly reflects the fact, of course, that the richest people are extremely rich. They've got very large amounts of income on which they can pay tax, but it also actually, let it be said that under this Conservative government, the tax system has become significantly more progressive towards higher earners. So with 60% rate over 100,000, 45% rate over 125,000, big reductions in the value of pension tax reliefs, and so on. But we are very dependent on a very small number of people, and it's important actually to be. The other thing I'd do in there is sort of distinguish between what do we mean by the top 1%. Well, roughly speaking, to be the top 1% of adults, you need, I can't remember, 130, 140,000 pounds a year. To be in the top 0.1%, you need about 650,000 pounds a year. That kind of number. I think very often when people talk about the top 1%, they really mean the top 0.1%. And part of that top 0.1%, they often pay a lot less tax than others because a large fraction of them are getting that money from capital gains, from businesses that they own, partnerships in partners in professional services firms, all of whom pay less tax than wage slaves, even wage slaves who are earning large amounts of earnings. So we're very dependent on this group for our revenues. And the other thing that's important is that among that top 0.1%, about a third of them were born abroad. So these are people who are not just theoretically able to leave the country. I mean, they may well be quite practically able to do that, and hence taking care, or at least being aware of the trade-offs that there might be there in terms of how they're taxed is inevitably important.
So a third of the 1%
of the 0.1%
of the 0.1% we rely on for how much of our revenue?
The top 0.1%, I think it's 6 or 7% of income tax. So
6,
they're paying 60 times more than their population share.
So a third were born abroad. It's an interesting political challenge, actually, because I've often slipped into that easy mindset of course, the threat of people taking flight is an empty one, but it seems as if there's some truism to it.
Well, many will obviously be settled here, and a lot of them, of course, are here because we have the world's biggest financial services centre here, and many of them will be very well settled, and the risk of them moving may be limited. But these things, take effect gradually and over time. So I don't know what the risks are, but I think one needs to be cognizant that there might be risks, and more than you'd think if none of them had been born abroad.
Let's move on and talk about public services, and maybe you could explore some of those trade-offs as well. So one thing I got from the book was that we are failing to invest. And I think we've always looked at that here through failing to put money aside to invest. But I know that you see it as a little bit differently, but our schools are crumbling. I think you said there's £1.4 billion that needs to be spent in the NHS for critical infrastructure. So this isn't for the new exciting stuff. This is actually to salvage equipment that would otherwise go defunct. Why doesn't Britain invest, and how do we change that?
Yeah, lack of investment over a long period has been a big problem for the British economy and beyond. So within public services, you're right. One of the things that happened through the 2010s in the health service was that as money was relatively tight overall, consistently already limited capital budgets got moved into current spending. So the result was that we didn't buy the MRI machines and the other sort of expensive bits of kit that you actually need to run an effective health service, let alone keep hospitals in a state from which they're not going to fall down. So the actually investing in that stuff, boring but incredibly important stuff, really matters to the fabric of some of our public services. I think it's less true in schools where, particularly actually following building schools for the future, many state schools are now, remarkably nice buildings, as I'm saying, they're palaces compared with the dump that I went to, which I've returned to recently and is also now a palace. But it's clearly very variable. Actually, Michael Gove himself has said that he now is one big regret from being Education Secretary was stopping building schools for the future, because there are still too many schools that haven't been refurbished. So that's the public services part of it. It's very short-sighted not to invest in those things. And then more broadly, of course, there's the country's infrastructure, of which I don't really talk much about transport in the book, but clearly underinvestment in, for example, Northern Rail, but much beyond that, has been a big problem for the country. And whilst actually at the moment investment spending is at a fairly high level by UK historic standards, it is still well below investment by most of our competitors. And actually, because we've been well below that for a very long period of time, this is something where the consequences of that build up over time, and it would take many years of relatively higher levels of investment to catch up with most of our counterparts.
So as we look, I think the understanding of what we've been spending and how we spent it in public services and the payoffs of that, or the lack of payoffs, is interesting, because one of the things that we do in this building is try and look to the future. So things like healthcare, for example, we get excited around preventative health and keeping people out of hospital. But someone who comes under a lot of flack in your book is Beveridge, William Beveridge himself, right? Who's sort of heralded and left-leaning circles as the creator of the welfare state. But I was interested reading his stuff that he himself said in 1945, just preempting the creation of the healthcare service, that it's going to pay for itself in the future because the nation will be healthier. And it feels like we're maybe having the same debates we've had in history, and the same conversations, and maybe the same hypotheses that have been disproven time and time again. They may be happening to us now. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I'm a bit mean to poor old William Beveridge, but he made a lot of predictions about both welfare, pensions, and health, which all turned out to be seriously wrong. But on health specifically, look, it's not. We spend 3 or 4 times as much as a fraction of national income on health care as we did back in the 1950s. And that's not terribly surprising. I mean, it's for one thing, as you get richer as a country, you're going to want to spend more on health. I mean, the one thing you do want to be is healthy and alive. So you're bound to spend more of your marginal pound on health. And every country has done the same. And we are in no sense unusual in the amount we spend on health. We're pretty average in the amount we spend on health, and in the way in which it's increased over time. Now, part of the reason for that increase over time is because there's just a huge demand for it as we get richer. Part of it is because we've got so much better at doing all sorts of things. I mean, the numbers of things you can cure in the NHS or through health systems now is vastly more than it used to be. I'm saying that, I mean, back in the 1940s, a lot of the key killers were infectious diseases. Now, COVID apart, that's just no longer true. It's dementia, it's heart disease, and in particular, it's cancer. But one of the things that's one of the problems with healthcare is that in most parts of the economy, if you get better at doing something over time, it gets cheaper. Well, it's not true with healthcare, because if you cure someone, the bugger comes back ill later on. Whereas if you don't kill them, that's it. So
it's an interesting policy steer there. So it's the challenge in healthcare then to reduce demand and keep demand reduced.
Well, you have to manage demand somehow, and at the moment we're doing the classic British thing of managing it through waiting lists, yes. which is not brilliant. Other countries do it a bit through managing through price. Others by just limiting the number of things that you can get attention for. I mean, if you look at again what happened over the New Labour years, waiting lists and so on came down, but actually with the expansion of both the NHS and the use of the private sector, many more people came forward for things like hip replacements than would have done in the past. People perhaps who weren't quite as desperate for them as they previously would have been. So there is a sort of balance that happens in these things. So there's inevitably a management of demand here. But clearly, and it's very, very evident at the moment, we've got a very big problem on the supply side at the moment.
Do you get excited about technology in that space? So things like patients owning their data, being able to maybe use community diagnostics, at-home diagnostics, self-referrals?
Yes, I think there's I get very excited by data, but they, but I mean, I think there's a lot that's available. I mean, you talk about community diagnostics and self diagnostics and so on. I mean, at the moment, we're sort of this absurd situation where the vast majority of diagnostics still happens in hospitals. Now, they are the worst place in the world to do diagnostic. There's no reason why diagnostics have to happen in hospitals. I'm doing some work with a private sector organization. Their view is there are two, and they're much more efficient at providing diagnostics than the NHS. And there are two reasons that they would give for that. One is their call center, which I don't think the NHS thinks very much about, which ensures that they have virtually 100% people turning up to their appointments, which is much higher than the NHS gets. And the other is that these multi-million-pound machines are used 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, not 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Now, put those two things together, and you get a great deal more efficiency, not through any kind of great whizzy technology, just having an efficient call center and an efficient use of resources. But yes, the future, I'm sure, will be more at-home diagnostics and that kind of thing. Though whether that will save money, given what it will do for demand, I think is a moot question.
So anything that increases demand is going to basically keep budgets the same or increase spend. It's about productivity gains, right, in the NHS? Well,
you need to do the best that you can with the resources that you've got. And certainly productivity gains are going to be absolutely crucial to that, whether that's through better management, whether that's through better staff management, or whether that's through better technology. Productivity gains are absolutely at the center of that. I mean, and there's a sort of there's an interesting issue here about sort of the relationship between upfront investment and later savings. Now, it is, and this is, I think this is a fair point, but it is very much built into the Treasury DNA that yes, we can spend money on prevention, but it's not going to save any money on health in the long run, because the health budget is just set by the demand of the health service. And even if we're healthier in the long run, that's not going to reduce, in their view, rightly or wrongly, but I think there is certainly some truth in this. It's not going to reduce the demands for spending on health. And that I think is one of the many reasons, and there are some good reasons and some bad reasons, why we've historically found it difficult to invest in what, in my view, would be an appropriate amount in these sorts of things which provide longer term benefits.
On that productivity question in public services, health's a great example, but you look at something like AI, ChatGPT, things that might replace jobs, and there's a negative conversation about that at the moment, but is there potential for those to make our public services both more efficient, more effective, but potentially cheaper as well?
I really don't cover that, as you know. I really don't cover that kind of issue in the book. I mean, we know that HMRC has shed very large numbers of people over the last 15 years because it's made better use of technology, for example. So there are clearly ways in which you can make public services more effective and efficient using technology. That said, in government, managing that efficiency with or without technology is really hard. That the Conservatives did a lot to reduce the size of the civil service through to 2016. It's now back up to, I think, roughly its maximum size. These sort of bureaucracies, and I think there's a key point here. They are self-perpetuating. So Whitehall took on a lot more people through COVID, and they've still got them. And it's really hard to manage that kind of thing.
I just want to touch on three themes, and then we should go to questions. We're also going to hear from James on our Future of Britain work. The first theme is around intergenerational inequality. This is actually a question that was submitted by someone prior to the event, which I think is an excellent one. Around the breakdown of what is essentially a post-Cold War consensus, right? So defense spending goes down whilst health and education spending goes up. But as we know, the Russian invasion of Ukraine means that defense spending is only going in one direction. So just Jacob Walduck asked, with demographic challenges arising from older populations making up an increasing share of the population, how should the state balance the needs of the old with a future orientated focus, i.e. education funding versus healthcare?
Well, one of the things that I say probably on more occasions than I should through the book is that we've had this remarkable shift over many decades, where, as I said earlier, we've had a much bigger fraction of the national cake devoted to health. And we've essentially paid for that by very dramatically reducing the share of the national cake spent on defence. So if you look, I mean, there's no graphs in there because my publisher said there mustn't be. But if you look at a graph of that, I mean, there's two lines that just cross, and then health replaces defence essentially in public spending. Very, very surprisingly, in my view, education hasn't grown as a fraction of the national income over the last 40 or 50 years. That's not something I would have guessed back in the 1970s or 1980s, that you'd look forward to the 2020s and public spending on education simply hasn't grown as a fraction of national income. And indeed, if you look in real terms at spending on school children since 2010, there's been no increase per child in spending on schooling over that period, which is remarkable. Now, the what about, and actually that sort of abolition of defence spending alongside the end of nationalised industry, stopping building houses and so on, is one of the reasons why up till now the tax burden has remained incredibly constant over a very long period. So it's been between 32-34% of national income for many, many decades. It's now going to take off. It's now going to hit probably 37 or more % of national income during the 2020s, which, 34, 37. I mean, that's another 100 billion of tax. And I reckon that's there for good, at least. I don't think that's going to go back down. And that's
what does it take to go back down? What are the big painful things?
Well, I mean, that first of all, that's a very big statement, because, as I say, it really hasn't gone up for decades. I don't think it's very hard. So, because of aging, because of the cost on the health service, pensions, social care, and because of the demands now, as you say, on defence spending, and the fact that we've had pretty austere 10 years plus in most other public services, if you wanted to get that tax level down, it's going to be really, really hard. And in particular, because we're also spending more on debt interest than we have at any time since the early 1960s, and we've got very poor economic growth. So you put all of those things together, and I think it's very hard to see how you get taxes down. Now, what could you get? Could help you get there? Well, real serious growth would help. I mean, in all of this, serious economic growth helps. And you just look at that in terms of spending on health, whereas a fraction of our total national income, we spend about an average amount, but because our national income's done so badly for the last 15 years, in cash terms, we spend rather less than some other countries with whom we used to be comparable. But it may be a failure of imagination on my part, but I find it quite hard to think of those things that you could do which would have a significant downward pressure on tax. I mean, you could completely abolish defence spending, or you could privatise part of the health service, or you could means test the state pension. But as soon as I say all those things, you can tell that none of them are particularly politically palatable. So and I think that's why under a Conservative government, we are seeing the biggest tax rises we've seen in my lifetime. I think it's because they want taxes to go up, but because they don't really see any obvious option. And as I say, it may well simply be a failure of imagination on my part, and maybe you could provide people with loans to go to sixth forms or even to secondary schools, or maybe you could charge for quite large parts of the health service, or maybe you could yet again dramatically cut investment spending. But I don't really think any of those would be terribly sensible.
Yeah, I think you just set out the Reform Party's manifesto there, so very stark. So feels like from your side there's inevitability around tax increasing and that tax burden increasing.
Certainly not about going back down.
Yeah.
I think as I say, it's gone from 33% to 37%. It's a big rise. It's worth saying it's still low by Western European standards.
Yeah. Let's do a Liz Truss then. Let's talk growth. So let's not actually do a Liz Truss. I get the impression, Liz Truss, you're not a big fan of budget in that book. It seems
No, well, apart from anything else, it's a nightmare having to rewrite the blooming book as we had the September's budget, which I had to rewrite it for, and then it was all undone and I had to rewrite it again. So definitely not a big fan.
Editorial read well. It sounds like it was written in one sitting, so you pulled that off there. But when it comes to growth, what's the low hanging fruit? Planning reform.
Yep, certainly that. I mean, in a sense, to go back to what I said right at the beginning, none of it's low hanging in the sense that there are always trade-offs. So yes, planning reform is important in terms of getting infrastructure built, in terms of getting more houses built. But the government lost the Amersham by-election and other by-elections because it was doing things. I think that was an HS2 issue. And coming back to your point about intergenerational equity, those who own houses in nice areas quite reasonably want to keep those areas nice, and in their view, nice means not having roads and other houses there. And so there is a cost. Someone will lose. Someone does lose if you build more houses, and generally speaking, it's the settled, or generally speaking, older and wealthier generation, and they've got a very strong voice, particularly in local politics. If you're a district council, and district council are responsible for a lot of planning choices, you'll probably lose all of your councillors if you say yes to a big new housing estate. So this isn't a technocratic problem. This is a political problem on the planning system. So planning is certainly a part of it, not necessarily a huge part, but it is a part of it. Reforming the tax system in ways which are pro-growth. I mean, our taxation of housing is catastrophically bad. I mean, stamp duty is a disaster. Council tax, which raises much higher rates of tax on very cheap houses in Hartlepool. I mean, many orders of magnitude higher council taxes as a fraction of value in Hartlepool than on mansions in Westminster. I mean, it's just, it's both inequitable and grossly inefficient, as are some of the things we talked about in terms of the tax system earlier. Infrastructure, housing, roads, rail, all of those things really matter. Research and development, closeness to the European single market. I mean, it is a fact. It is not an opinion that coming out of the single market and customs union is economically costly. Again, there's a trade-off there if you believe in sovereignty and taking back control and so on. But my view from an economic point of view is that we've been on the wrong side of trade-off after trade-off after trade-off over the last 15 years and more when it's come to that. And one of the consequences is that in terms of real incomes and real earnings, I mean, we've had the worst 15 years for earnings growth since the Napoleonic Wars over the last 15 years. And that is, there are lots of reasons for that. And partly it's because of the financial crisis and our dependence on the financial system and so on. But partly it's the cumulative effect of policy decisions taking over a long period of time. And the last thing I should say is clearly education really matters for growth, and education at all points from the early years right the way through. If I had to put my finger on one area where I think our system really fails, it's 16 plus, particularly for those not going on to university, but it's pretty bad for those who are because of the very narrow curriculum with very poor vocational qualification system and a very poor offer for those who are not doing well at GCSEs at 16. And all of those things, as well as those people doing going to university and so on, very important for growth. Very interesting things not in the book because I only saw it last week. Actually, it's a paper that Ed Balls has written with an academic from Harvard. Shows something I hadn't realized, which is really remarkable, which is that outside of London, the returns to having a degree in a non-STEM subject have dropped like a stone over the last 20 years. STEM has held up and London has held up, but non-STEM outside London is not getting you anything like the kind of earnings boost it used to get you. So again, that may tell you, I don't know exactly what that tells you, but that's the sort of my fact of the week in terms of what I've heard recently.
That's great. Add to your armory of facts, of which there are many. I mean, that seems to me like a clear agenda then for growth, which is that, the political zeitgeist, plan and reform, investments in infrastructure, education. Why aren't the political parties embracing this wholesale and going at it?
Well, partly because it's easy to say all of that and much harder to do. I mean, it's very easy for me to sit here and say those are the sorts of things that you need to do, but actually getting it right is really difficult. It's actually really difficult to get it right in education, particularly given some of the constraints we have. If we're going to keep GCSEs, if we're going to keep A levels, we're going to keep our selective university system, it's quite hard to work around all of that. Building infrastructure is hard. Because you annoy people if you build a railway line through their back garden, and we're also the extraordinary thing about infrastructure spending is we continually, and we've always done this, and we did it even bigger actually during New Labour years, just underspend. I mean, Whitehall cannot get the money out the door. The procurement is hopeless. So the details of all of these things are really hard. I mean, we know what the issues are with the European Union and where the politics are around that, and reforming the tax system is hard because any reform, unless you've got piles of money to throw out, it makes some people worse off. That's hard.
Very clear, big political challenge, but it feels like now, if there's ever a time for taking on some of these big political shibboleths, now is it. There's a make or break moment for the country. And obviously one of the biggest challenges we're going to confront, and I'll finish on this before going to James, is around climate change. And you cover this in your book, and you talk about the fiscal costs. I'd say you're probably more positive than I anticipated you being on the actual fiscal element of climate change and what we need to spend as a country in order to get there. There obviously is a cost to it. But I'd love you just to touch on this one issue around fuel duty and road tax, because it's an interesting political conundrum, which isn't actually that far away in terms of impacting us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, the real costs of adapting to climate change and removing carbon emissions is around building renewable energy and finding ways of replacing gas boilers and so in our homes, which I think is much the most difficult thing is home heating. But the point about fuel duty is, in terms of fiscal cost, if we're not buying petrol, which we won't be at some time in the next 30 years or so, we're not going to be paying petrol taxes, and that will cost the Treasury more than 30 billion a year, even after the real levels of petrol taxes have come down really dramatically over the last decade. I mean, the OBR said a couple of weeks ago that had fuel duties risen in line with inflation since 2010, as they're supposed to in law, we'd have got an extra 80 billion of revenue in over that period, not per year, but cumulatively over that period. That's a lot of revenue given up by not increasing fuel duties in line with inflation, which is a strange thing to do. One might think in a world in which you really care about climate change. But going forward, there's 30 billion still to lose. And that's a lot of money to lose, which we'll need to make up from somewhere else if we don't replace it. And be very inefficient, because actually the biggest externality you create by driving is the congestion that you cause for other road users. So there's a good case, economic case, for taxing road use anyway. So we really ought to be starting to, I was going to say, have the conversation, but actually get going on road user charging, which might just be a purely charge per mile driven, which is essentially what a petrol tax is. It's a charge per mile driven. The technology is now there. It's really should be very straightforward to do relative to, we were thinking about this 20 years ago in the Treasury, but the technology then was much more difficult. But it's going to be really hard to introduce that once everyone's in an electric car and got used to not paying tax. It's going to be very hard to do it then. So we should probably start to get ahead of the game now. Obviously politically difficult, but otherwise we just give up 30 billion of revenue, and that's another, whatever that is, another 4 or 5p on income tax.
A huge challenge, and obviously for climate more broadly, we talk here about the decade of electrification and what's going to be required in terms of building. So plan and reform comes into this, as well as capital investment, and the Treasury actually being able to spend the money in the first place. But I don't fully appreciate just how much needs to be built in the next decade in order to electrify the country, but a huge and exciting challenge. I'm going to go to questions. I'm going to introduce a tax of my own in the spirit of today's conversation. If anyone stands up and says, I have a comment to make, or this is more of a comment than a question, you will be taxed. So no monologues, apart from one person, which is James Brown. And James, can I ask you to go first, because James has been leading our Future Britain work from a fiscal perspective, and this is looking what we might do from an economic perspective in the future in order to address some of the challenges that Paul's laid out in his book. So James, over to you.
So thanks, Ryan, and thanks, Paul. It's a really fascinating conversation, and a really fascinating book that Paul's written, full of really great anecdotes and backed up by loads of great research. So I think one of the things that really struck me when I read Paul's book was just how much money we're spending on palliative things. So solving problems when things go wrong, rather than spending money to prevent problems from arising in the first place. And I think what you see looking forward is that dealing with this is going to become a much more urgent problem. With an aging society, the costs of things like health and pensions is only going to increase over time. So doing more on prevention is only going to become more and more necessary over time. And the OBR takes a very long-term look at the pressures on different areas of spending every year in one of the publications it puts out. And it shows just how much the cost of health and pensions is likely to increase over time. And even if we're just looking in the next 20 years, we're likely to see the cost of healthcare increase by about 2% of national income, and the cost of pensions by about 1% of national income within that 20-year period. And to accommodate this, using the sort of tax increases that we've seen in recent decades, we'll be looking at bigger increases in tax than we've seen over the last 20 years in the next 20 years. So we've seen over the last 20 years about 2p on national insurance contribution rates, 2.5% on VAT. You'll be looking at even more than that over the next 20 years on current trends. So some of the work we've been doing here at TBI, and it's also echoed in the Hewitt review that was put out this morning, has focused on what you can do with preventative spend to improve public health. So at the moment, we're only about 1% of the NHS budget goes towards measures that look to improve public health rather than just curing people who are sick. And that's despite estimates that that these sorts of measures have about a 3 or 4 times greater impact at the margin than spending on the NHS. As new tech comes on stream over time, what we're likely to see is that health professionals will be able to diagnose things earlier and more accurately. So being able to treat things, nip things in the bud as soon as they go wrong with people. And also individuals will be able to monitor health for themselves through things like wearables. But we'll also need much greater focus on the things that are driving health, whether that's personal factors, environmental health factors, or factors in the workplace. And this can help reduce public spending on health in 2 distinct ways. First, if we're able to increase healthy life expectancy, that pushes some of the costs of providing healthcare later in life. But actually, most of the pressure on health spending that we've seen in recent years hasn't come from aging, but from non-demographic factors, whether that's new treatments and drugs becoming available or growing rates of obesity and diabetes. So we really need to focus on those if we're going to avoid the situation where we're spending more and more of our national income on healthcare. And better population health is going to be important for spending in other areas too. What we've seen over the last 20, 25 years, again, as Paul shows in his book, is much higher spending on disability benefits, particularly at younger ages, and for people with mental health problems. Also, if we're able to improve people's healthy life expectancy, that means we can potentially look to increase the state pension age more quickly than is currently set to happen under current policy, where we're going from 66 to 67 later this decade and then to 68 by the mid-2040s. And as Paul's colleagues at the IFS have shown, every year that we're able to delay the state pension age, that would save us about 8 or 9 billion a year in today's terms. And another thing we'll need to do to keep the cost of pensions escalating is to look at the level of the state pension. With this triple lock that we have at the moment, whereby the pension goes up by the higher of inflation, earnings growth, and 2.5% a year, what we'll see is the level of the state pension ratcheting up as a share of average earnings over time. If instead we keep state pensions at their current levels relative to earnings, and that would significantly reduce the need for tax rises for future generations, and ensure that everyone pays at least roughly the same amount of tax and receives roughly the same amount of benefits in retirement. Indeed, in looking at the review of state pension ages that came out last week from Baroness Neville Rolfe, she recommended that the government should seek to limit state pension spending to about 6% of national income. If you keep with the triple lock, that limit would be breached about 2050. If instead you move to a single lock where it just goes up in line with earnings growth, that won't happen until the late 2060s. So we won't need to have any further increases in state pension age until a lot later on. I think really what's coming out of all of this, and the conversation we've had earlier, and Paul's book and my remarks, is just the need for much more long-term thinking about the costs and benefits of particular policies. It's very easy for politicians to promise additional spending to ease a crisis in the health system, or to give additional money to pensioners. It's much harder to invest money in areas where there's not such an immediate return, but over the longer term, the yield from investment will be far greater.
Thank you, James. That's excellent. Really appreciate it. Does that excite you, Paul?
All of this stuff excites me. No, absolutely. I mean, James has set out part of the challenge that I set out in the book, which is that we are in a world where if we carry on as we are, then we're just going to be spending more on health, more on pensions, more on social care. We're raising taxes in a very inefficient way. We've not sort of overhauled any of those systems in many decades, and those are all things that in the long run it is perfectly possible to deal with in a rational way. And I think I very much echo James's last words about needing to do this over the long term. And one of the things I say at the end of the book is governments are powerful. Governments can make a big difference. They can make a big difference to the growth of the economy, as well as to the structure of public services and how well they're delivered. But they can't do that in 1 or 2 years, which is very often what the time span that ministers think of. I mean, I go on and on in there about how frequently ministers change. I think we've had more housing ministers than we've had years this century, and we've had something like 15 education secretaries or something since I was in the education department in the beginning of the 2000s. And you just can't do stuff unless you've got at least 5 years. And I think if you're looking at new government, should be thinking of a 10-year program of change in a single sort of strategic direction. Obviously be willing to change as the world changes, but actually have a clear view of what you want to achieve. And without making too much of a political point, I mean, there's clearly been rather a lack of that since 2010. And as your boss will tell you, it took him a while to work it out after he became he entered number 10, and I'm not sure that a new government's going to have that time to sort itself out.
Absolutely. So I want to take some questions from the room. We've got some from online that have come through on the phone. Can I see a show of hands in the room for anyone who wants to ask a question? I know that in this room, there's at least 10 members of the British Cabinet in 2050, and I'm disappointed not to see all your hands up. Tom, the exciting thing is you get to come to this microphone and ask the question.
Thank you. Does that work?
Yep.
Yeah. So if you were going to advise the government on a future COVID-like disease that had come about, what would your advice be in terms of lockdowns, sick pay, economic advice that they should consider?
Oh God. I mean, I think let me be honest. I think that answers to that question tell you almost as much about the sort of instinctive views of the person answering it as they do about the about what the real answer is, because obviously it's going to depend on just about everything about the disease and and so on. What I discovered through COVID is I'm more of a libertarian than I realized, actually. And I think that the damage done by lockdowns was very significant. That said, had I been in number 10, I'd probably have done almost exactly the same thing, apart from the parties that actually happened, which was, I think, you had an instinctive libertarian actually there who locked down when he felt he had no choice. And I guess that the response that you really want is one where you're sort of not being forced into a corner by locking down later than is probably optimal first time round, and then probably unlocking down later than was optimal as well. I think we need to take very serious consideration of the impact this has had on children. I think we still don't know what that's going to be. We know some have been lost from school. We know a lot have lost significant parts of their education. We know from everyone we know that there's a generation who are going into sixth form and university who are just a bit different because of the impacts of what happened through COVID. So I don't know the answer to your question. I think it's extraordinarily difficult on that front. In terms of the economic policies, we need to learn, and it'll be different next time. But what do we learn from this time? Well, we got it completely wrong in a sense, in terms of not necessarily the specific policies, but in terms of what we were worried about. So 2 years ago, whenever, I forget when it was, but anyway, through COVID, I mean, we were all worried that once you got rid of furlough, got rid of all the sports schemes, you have this mass upsurge in unemployment. You got absolutely the reverse. We've got a lack of labour, and why? Well, I think there are lots of reasons, but one reason is we had obviously kind of through hundreds of billions fiscally at the economy, and through hundreds of billions through quantitative easing at the economy, and put those two together, and we've got a combination of very tight labour market, and it's certainly one of the reasons for high inflation. So my view is that monetary policy at least was too loose over that period, and probably furlough went on for too long. But that was very difficult politically at the time.
It just seemed to be a distinct lack of commentary at the time as well about inflation. My rudimentary understanding of economics, pouring all that money onto the economy, it just felt like inflation would be inevitable, but very little commentary. We've had Larry Summers over in the US talking about it, but
yeah, it's and again, it's very easy to kind of look with hindsight and indeed review one's view of what one thought at the time. But yes, I mean, I think broadly speaking, the fiscal response was probably right. If as I say, it went on too long, and arguably furlough, you could argue was too generous. But but I think in retrospect, at least, monetary policy didn't need to be as loose as it was.
Great. So we've got time for a couple of questions. So I'm going to go Rosie, then Jess, then I've got a couple online, and we should be able to wrap up then. To the mic.
Thank you for coming in, Paul. I haven't read your book yet, so excuse the simplicity of this
Yes, it's fine.
Yeah. Do you have a particular position on inheritance tax in particular? I'm intrigued by this as a uniquely polarizing policy area, but I also think could potentially be an interesting way to raise money. So I'm intrigued to hear your views.
So let's do inheritance tax, but Jess, do you want to ask your question? And then Paul, if you take them as two, that'd be great. And then I'll just finish.
That actually works really well because my question is very linked. But thanks for coming in. I also wanted to just get your view on sort of housing tax reform, because obviously intergenerational housing is a huge issue, and reading around things like taxing income from landlords, for example. Do you have a view on, if you were looking after housing, what you do in that?
Okay, two big questions. I mean, inheritance tax. You're right. It results in very polarized views. It's the most unpopular tax in the country, despite the fact only about 5% of people pay it. So that tells you kind of something about it. And yet, for sort of classical liberals, let alone socialists, it's the kind of obvious tax, because you're taxing something. If I inherit a load, it's not through any good that I've done. It's just pure luck. But if you look at it from the point of view of the person giving, then they've already been taxed on this. Why should they pay tax again? And it's the it's the deepest human need to give things to your children. So you can see why there are conflicting views. There are definitely things you could do to make it better. At the moment, it's ridiculously easy to avoid if you've got more. If you've got more than just a house and a pension, it's very, very, very easy to avoid. Either you can give the money away, more than 7 years before you die, or as I quote in the book, you sell what assets you've got, buy shares on the AIM market, live for a couple of years, and it's all free of inheritance tax. Or you are a farmer, then it's all free of inheritance tax, and so on and so on. So at the moment, it's ridiculously easy to avoid. I think one of the reasons that it's unpopular is that it actually impacts what you might think of as the sort of comfortable middle classes much more than it does the properly rich, because, to say, if your main asset's your house, really quite hard to avoid. If you've got a lot more than your house, it's an absolute doddle to avoid. So you need to sort that. I think you need to sort that out as a first aim. You're never going to get vast amounts of money from it. It's not going to move the dial, and it's one of the few taxes where there are much bigger differences across countries than others. I mean, every tax has an income tax and a social insurance contribution and a VAT and so on. But a lot of countries, including Scandinavian ones, don't have an inheritance tax at all. And some do it in the hands of the person who receives it. In Ireland, for example, we do it in the hands of the person giving or the person who dies. So there's a lot more variation. But I think in the book, I quote my favorite fiscal motto from the US, which against inheritance tax, which is no taxation without respiration, which tells you something about the sort of difficulties with selling it. But yes, I mean, it's a classic liberal view, which I'm, it's that what you inherit is not deserved and therefore is appropriate to tax. But the practicality, I would start off just by sorting out a whole series of the practicalities around that. On housing, well, at the moment we've got sort of two taxes on housing: council tax and stamp duty, both of which are catastrophically badly designed. I mean, I would abolish stamp duty. It's I mean, that sounds like a very regressive thing to do, since it's much more incident on very expensive properties, but it results in much less movement in the housing market. It creates problems for labour mobility, and it creates sort of economic problems because people can't be in the places that they want to be, as well as big personal costs. The cost of buying the wrong house and then wanting to move is huge. Council tax, I think, should be much more. It should be, in my view, proportional to the value of the property that you're in. Not regressive, very regressive in that, and obviously based on more up-to-date valuations. Although, again, trade-offs, that's going to make some people worse off, and they're not going to be very happy. You talked about taxation of landlords. So I think there's two issues in there. Actually, you don't want to tax landlords in general more than they are at the moment if you want an operating rental sector. And indeed, it may be the case that one of the reasons that the numbers of rental properties are going down is because landlords can no longer deduct mortgage interest from their tax bills. It may be, on the other hand, that actually what you want to achieve, even in a way that's somewhat inefficient, is more owner-occupied housing. So if you kind of make sure there are fewer landlords, well, that's going to push rent up, but it might make owner occupation more viable for more people. So that's a big choice, actually. My colleagues at the IFS would certainly take the view that the neutral and appropriate taxation of rental housing is to allow mortgage deduction. But if you take the strong view that you want to force owner occupation at the cost of less rental property, then you could tax that more. But it's not, again, it's not an obvious answer, just tax landlords more, because the impact is fewer rental properties.
Thank you, Paul. We're at time now. Some excellent questions come in online. Shame we never got to them, but we'll make sure that, that they're put to you separately. I just want to say a huge thank you for writing this book. I think it's an important contribution to the public debate. I think it's really important that if we're trying to transform Britain, that we properly understand how it's made up, what its fiscal base is, how it spends money, where it spends money, how much money it spends. And there is so much to that in this book. So it's a great publication. Follow the money. I'd say one of the best things you can do with your own money is buy this book by Paul.
I didn't even pay him to say that.
We'll talk about commission later. Well, thank you so much. On behalf of the Institute Future Britain, people online, huge round of applause. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.